The Liberty ship SS John Morgan was built to survive the unforgiving Atlantic. Yet, on the night of June 10, 1943, under a heavy fog off Cape Henry, Virginia, it became one of the war's most mysterious wrecks. Within moments of colliding with another vessel, the tanker Montana, the John Morgan erupted into flames, breaking apart before anyone could issue a distress call. By dawn, only scattered debris and burning oil marked the spot where one of the U.S. Navy's most secret transports had gone down. At first, it seemed another tragic wartime accident in a theater already littered with wrecks. The Liberty ships were workhorses, 2,700 of them built to carry everything from food to tanks across U-boat-infested waters. But this particular vessel had left Baltimore under heightened security. Even the crew knew little about its cargo. The manifest listed mechanical parts and ammunition, bound for the British under Lend-Lease. Yet the ship had an unusually heavy armed guard and several sealed compartments restricted to naval personnel only. Within 48 hours, a recovery order came down, not from the Coast Guard or Maritime Commission, but directly from the U.S. Navy's Experimental Diving Unit in Washington, D.C., led by Lieutenant Commander Harold Vance. The EDU was known for high-risk underwater operations involving advanced technology and classified retrievals. Their mission was simple on paper: recover sensitive materials before enemy intelligence, or the sea, claimed them for good. The divers arrived at Little Creek Naval Base just as smoke from the wreck still drifted across the horizon. They prepared their gear: Mark V hard hat suits, brass helmets, weighted boots, and surface-supplied oxygen lines. The sea was rough, visibility poor, but orders were explicit: descend to the wreck and secure anything marked with a blue triangle or serial code beginning with X. 4 seasoned men who had trained in Panama and Pearl Harbor, it was a familiar task, but something about this mission felt different. Chief Diver Henry Sloan later recalled in his logbook, they kept repeating, "Don't talk about what you find. Don't record serial numbers. Don't question the cargo." It was an unusual directive for a salvage dive, especially for a ship not yet entered into official loss reports. Still, the men followed orders. By 0900 hours on June 12, the first dive commenced. The wreck lay at a depth of roughly 110 feet, accessible but perilous in the murky Atlantic waters. The John Morgan's bow was twisted, her forward hold torn open by the collision. Crates were scattered like matchsticks, many split open, revealing brass shells, detonators, and what looked like aircraft parts. But the divers noticed something else: a sealed steel container wedged between the collapsed bulkheads of hold number 2, marked only with an X-12 stencil. When Sloan radioed up to report it, Vance's voice came back tight. "Secure it. Don't open it. Tag for recovery." That container would become the center of weeks of speculation. One diver, Lieutenant Frank Mallory, wrote later in a private letter to his wife, "I can't tell you what we found, only that it wasn't ammunition. There are things about this job that don't belong in the open sea." His words, declassified decades later, give a glimpse into the tension that hung over the operation. Mallory was young, meticulous, and trusted by his men, but his growing unease was evident in every log entry he made. As the recovery continued, the divers encountered strange inconsistencies. Certain cargo holds listed in the manifest didn't exist. Crates bore British serial codes from radar development projects, and yet no British officers were officially attached to the mission. Vance's team realized they were handling materials not meant to be acknowledged, equipment possibly tied to radar or communications research far ahead of anything publicly known in 1943. One stormy afternoon, as divers struggled to stabilize the lifting cables, Sloan remarked through his comms line, "Feels like the sea doesn't want us here." It wasn't superstition, it was exhaustion, fear, and the weight of secrecy pressing down harder than the ocean above them. The recovery continued for 9 days. By then, only fragments of the cargo had been raised, including parts labeled T-44 transmitter array and Mk3 power coupling. When the John Morgan's stern section was located a few hundred yards away, the divers expected to find the remaining crates. Instead, the area had been scoured clean, as if swept by deliberate human hands. No cargo, no wreckage, just sand and silence. At the final debrief in Washington, the EDU team was told the operation never happened. Their dive logs were collected, reports redacted, and the John Morgan sinking was officially attributed to ammunition detonation following collision. The men signed non-disclosure papers under threat of court-martial. Only years later, fragments of their accounts would reappear in private archives, each one hinting at something much larger than a wartime accident. Decades on, maritime historians still question why such urgency surrounded a ship supposedly carrying routine supplies. The John Morgan's classified manifest remains sealed in naval archives, its true contents hidden behind restricted national security stamps. But for those divers who risked their lives in the cold Atlantic that week, one truth was clear. The sea had swallowed more than steel, it had swallowed a secret meant to stay buried. The summer heat of 1943 pressed down on the docks at Little Creek as the recovery team prepared for a second descent. The wreck of the SS John Morgan still lay beneath the churning Atlantic, silent, half-buried, and far from finished yielding its secrets. The first dives had raised questions no one dared to ask aloud. What was the ship carrying, and why was the Navy so desperate to retrieve it in absolute secrecy? Lieutenant Frank Mallory's diary captures the unease. "Orders came down this morning," he wrote on June 14th. "Recover crates marked X-12 through X-17. Do not open. Do not discuss." The message was signed by a commander Mallory had never met, attached to Naval Communications Command, not salvage. Even Vance, his commanding officer, seemed uneasy. "We're not supposed to know," he muttered while tightening his helmet's faceplate before the next dive. The divers entered the water just after dawn. Visibility was worse than ever, less than 10 feet. They descended by touch, their guide ropes stretching into the black void below. When Mallory and Sloan reached hold number 2 again, they found more of the mysterious containers. Each one was reinforced steel, built far sturdier than standard munitions boxes, and sealed with welded clasps rather than bolts. None of them appeared on the ship's manifest. As they worked, Mallory noticed faint scorch marks along the inside of the hull, not from the collision or fire above, but from an explosion that had occurred inside the hold. The discovery didn't match the official version of the sinking. "If this was just an accident," he later told Sloan through his headset, "why does it look like someone tried to destroy something from within?" When they surfaced, Navy intelligence officers were already waiting on deck. They confiscated the dive notes and sealed the recovered containers in tarps. The lead officer, a thin, sharp-voiced man wearing no insignia, simply said, "These materials are under direct War Department jurisdiction." None of the divers ever saw those crates again. That evening, while reviewing dive footage in the mess hall, Mallory noticed something chilling. On the last frame before surfacing, the camera briefly caught a human figure, motionless, lying against the wreckage, wearing a uniform unlike any U.S. Navy issue. The insignia was British, and yet, no British crew had been assigned to the John Morgan. When he showed the frame to Vance, his superior turned pale. "We'll handle that," he said quietly, before ordering the footage locked in a classified container. The tension among the men grew thicker by the hour. Rumors circulated that the ship had been carrying experimental radar components developed jointly with British scientists under a project called Bolero Link. If true, it would explain the secrecy, but not the presence of unidentified personnel. "You start wondering," Sloan recalled years later, "whether we were cleaning up after an accident or covering something up." The next morning, the crew received new orders. All recovered materials were to be transported by convoy to Washington, D.C., under Marine escort. No records were to indicate their origin. The divers were instructed to resume salvage only for non-classified equipment, a vague directive that effectively ended their mission's core objective. Mallory's final entry that week was terse and haunted. "We are not salvers anymore. We are witnesses to something buried deeper than the ship itself. I fear we've seen too much. Command doesn't want answers, they want silence." In the days that followed, 2 of the younger divers requested reassignment. One complained of constant headaches and nausea, perhaps from prolonged decompression, perhaps from stress. Another stopped showing up for duty altogether. The team morale collapsed under the weight of secrecy. Meanwhile, naval dispatches from Washington began using coded language in reference to the operation. Project Iron Mail appeared in classified communiques, followed by repeated notes of communication interference. Historians now believe those words were deliberate obfuscations, concealing the fact that all transmissions from the wreck area were being jammed. By the time the team left Delaware waters, nothing remained of the John Morgan but twisted metal and unanswered questions. The divers believed their mission was over, but Washington had other plans. Within weeks, 2 of the men, including Frank Mallory, would be reassigned to a new dive under even more suspicious orders. As one officer later put it, the Navy buries its secrets in the sea. But sometimes, the sea doesn't keep them quiet. The Atlantic was calm that morning, but the men of the experimental diving unit felt an unease that no still water could soothe. It was June 18, 1943, 8 days since the SS John Morgan went down, and the Navy had quietly ordered a renewed dive, citing unrecovered classified components. Frank Mallory, now acting as lead diver, was skeptical. They had already retrieved everything their manifests didn't list. So what, exactly, were they being sent back to find? Before the dive, Mallory overheard Commander Vance arguing with a naval intelligence officer on deck. "We're divers, not spooks," Vance said sharply. "If this is about more than salvage, my men have a right to know." The officer, calm and clipped, replied only, "Your right to know ends where your clearance does." That exchange would be the last time anyone heard Vance speak in protest. By 0800 hours, Mallory led a 3-man team into the water. Himself, Chief Diver Sloan, and Petty Officer Raymond Holt, a 23-year-old from Norfolk on his first Atlantic assignment. The men descended along a weighted line toward the ship's engine room, guided only by faint glimmers of their lamps. Their objective was to secure a section of the stern recently located by sonar. But the wreck had shifted since their last visit. Sand drifts had moved, and the structure now rested at a steeper angle, as if disturbed by recent currents, or something else. Halfway through the descent, Sloan reported a snag in his line. Mallory signaled him to hold position, but then Holt's voice crackled through the comm line. "Sir, I see something. Looks like lights ahead, not from our lamps." Moments later, static filled the channel. When the surface team tried to re-establish contact, they received nothing but the hollow rush of underwater noise. 20 minutes passed before Sloan reappeared at the surface, his breathing ragged, his eyes wild behind the faceplate. Holt and Mallory were gone. Sloan's account, recorded hours later, was fragmented and distraught. "We reached the lower deck. I saw Frank near the generator room door. He was trying to pry something open. Holt was to his left. Then everything went dark. My line jerked, like it was cut. When I turned back, both were gone." The surface crew immediately launched a secondary dive, but strong currents forced them to abandon the search. All they found were the severed ends of 2 communication lines, cleanly sliced. The Navy's official report labeled it a dive equipment malfunction. Yet the precision of those cuts raised doubts. Mark V helmets used reinforced oxygen hoses, nearly impossible to sever by accident. Sloan insisted it wasn't the sea that took them, it was human interference. "Someone didn't want that part of the wreck explored," he told a chaplain days later. That same evening, the local Coast Guard station reported a strange incident. A fishing vessel, Ellen Marie, claimed to have seen a small, unmarked Navy craft near the site, running with lights off, its crew wearing black oilskins with no insignia. When the Coast Guard tried to approach, the ship vanished into fog. The report was filed, then swiftly classified. In Washington, the Navy prepared public statements explaining the divers' deaths as tragic losses in hazardous operations. Families were sent condolences. Mallory's wife received a folded flag and a short letter signed by a clerk. There was no mention of what her husband had been doing, or why his body was never recovered. Years later, when Sloan was interviewed for an oral history project, he struggled to recount the loss. "We weren't just losing men," he said quietly. "We were losing truth. The kind that disappears under orders." Declassified internal memos later revealed that, following the disappearance, Navy intelligence recommended cessation of non-essential dives at the John Morgan site. But not all believed the case closed. Within weeks, cryptic communications appeared between U.S. and British naval offices referencing unconfirmed recovery of British operative equipment, Bolero extension. This link to Britain's secret radar program only deepened the enigma surrounding Mallory's final mission. As one modern historian, Dr. Thomas Ellery, observed in 1991, when two divers vanished from the John Morgan wreck, the sea didn't just swallow men, it swallowed the last witnesses to an operation that was never supposed to exist. The Navy sealed all records related to the loss for 50 years. And though the ocean gave up fragments of the ship in later years, it never returned Frank Mallory or Raymond Holt. To this day, their names rest on the Naval Memorial in Washington under a simple inscription, Lost in Service, June 18, 1943, Atlantic Operations Classified. The war moved on, but the mystery of the SS John Morgan refused to sink quietly. For decades, the incident remained buried beneath naval bureaucracy, dismissed as another wartime mishap. Yet, behind locked vaults in Washington and London, fragments of truth lingered, enough to suggest that what went down with that Liberty ship in 1943 was far more consequential than anyone had dared to admit. In 1978, the Freedom of Information Act forced the declassification of certain wartime communications. Among them were dispatches referencing Project Bolero Link, a joint Anglo-American radar initiative designed to synchronize Allied air defense systems across the Atlantic. The project had been shrouded in secrecy because it aimed to transmit high-frequency radar data in real time between Washington and London, a feat nearly impossible with 1940s technology. The John Morgan, as it turned out, had been carrying prototype components for that system. One of the most revealing documents came from the archives of the Admiralty in London. Dated May 30, 1943, it warned that transmission apparatus aboard designated Liberty transport is of critical experimental value. Recovery in event of loss is mandatory. The ship in question was unnamed, but the departure date matched that of the John Morgan. A later U.S. memo confirmed it. The Liberty ship's mysterious X-marked crates were, in fact, experimental radar amplifiers and signal relays intended for RAF trials in Britain. Captain Edward Harding, a retired U.S. Navy historian, later summarized it in his book Silent Currents. The Atlantic didn't just swallow steel, it swallowed a secret that could have shortened the air war. The John Morgan was carrying the first link in a transatlantic radar chain that would have changed how the Allies fought the skies. But the revelation raised more questions than it answered. If the mission had been so critical, why had the recovery been handled by divers under sealed orders instead of regular naval engineers? And why were the surviving members of the team threatened into silence? Investigators in the 1980s began to piece together the inconsistencies. One key clue came from sonar imaging conducted by a University of Delaware marine research vessel. The scans revealed that large portions of the wreck, especially around hold number 2 and the stern, appear to have been cleanly removed. The cuts were too precise to be caused by currents or corrosion. Someone had returned to the wreck long after 1943, likely with advanced equipment, and taken something. At the same time, British researchers uncovered correspondence between the Admiralty and the U.S. War Department dated 1944, referencing recovered components from previous Atlantic loss now secured. It implied that at least part of the radar technology had eventually been retrieved, but when, how, and by whom remained unclear. No operation was ever recorded, and no salvage permits were issued in those waters for decades. To many historians, this pointed to one unsettling possibility. An unacknowledged joint recovery mission had taken place under the veil of Cold War secrecy. The technology, initially meant for wartime radar development, could have provided post-war advantage in communications or early electronic intelligence. In that light, the Navy's silence made grim sense. Meanwhile, the human cost of that secrecy was all but forgotten. Families of the missing divers, including Frank Mallory's widow, never received clarification. He died serving his country, her son recalled in a 1990 interview, but they never told us what he was serving. For her, the mystery was not about radar or intelligence. It was about why the Navy refused to tell the truth. In 1994, after half a century of silence, the U.S. Navy quietly designated the wreck of the John Morgan a site of restricted maritime interest, forbidding private exploration. No explanation was given. The classification only fueled public speculation. Journalists began to call it America's forgotten enigma ship, drawing parallels to other wartime vessels that carried secrets too sensitive to disclose. One internal memo from the late 1940s, uncovered by a naval archivist, summed it up chillingly: technological loss recoverable, human loss regrettable but contained. Those 6 words embodied the cold calculus of wartime secrecy, the kind that erased men's names to protect machines and ideas. What began as a tragic maritime accident had evolved into a shadowed chapter of wartime innovation, one wrapped in missing records and silent graves. For decades, the world thought the John Morgan had perished carrying routine supplies. Only now did it become clear: the ship was a lifeline in a technological race, and someone, somewhere, had made sure its secret cargo didn't stay lost forever. Yet even as new files surfaced, one question remained unanswered: if parts of the wreck were indeed recovered, who conducted the operation? And more disturbingly, what else did they take? By the mid-1960s, 2 decades after the war, new technology rekindled old questions. Advances in deep-sea diving and sonar imaging had made it possible to explore wrecks once considered unreachable. The SS John Morgan, lying just beyond the continental shelf off Delaware's coast, suddenly drew attention again, not from historians, but from within the U.S. Navy itself. In 1967, Commander Robert "Bob" Harkins, a seasoned Navy diver who had served during Korea, received unexpected orders. His unit, based at the Naval Ordnance Test Station in Key West, was tasked with site verification and artifact recovery from a World War II wreck. The coordinates pointed to the long-forgotten John Morgan. The mission brief was unusually thin, just a single page stamped confidential and signed by the Department of Naval Research. Harkins was an analytical man, not easily swayed by rumor, but something about this job felt off from the start. There were no operational details, no recovery objectives, no reason for the sudden interest in a 20-year-old wreck, he later told colleagues. Still, orders were orders. His team prepared the latest gear: Mark 12 diving rigs, helium-oxygen mixtures, and submersible lighting systems capable of illuminating deep wreck interiors, technology unimaginable to Mallory's team back in 1943. When they reached the site in June, sonar imaging immediately raised eyebrows. The ship's outline was partially intact, but large rectangular sections of the hull were conspicuously missing, cleanly cut, not eroded. Harkins noted in his log, hull breach patterns suggest mechanical removal, not natural deterioration. Precision consistent with industrial salvage. The team couldn't confirm who had made the cuts or when, but the precision indicated modern intervention. Their first descent revealed a haunting scene. The wreck's superstructure lay half buried in silt, fish darting through twisted beams. In the holds, scattered shells and twisted steel remained, but whole cargo spaces were empty, as if deliberately cleared. Then came the moment that confirmed every whisper of a cover-up. On the port side, beneath a layer of sand, divers found an anchor chain embedded in the silt, attached to nothing. Someone had moored a vessel there long after the war. After surfacing, Harkins requested communication with Naval Operations Command for clarification. The reply came quickly but offered nothing: continue survey. No independent reporting authorized. It was then that he realized their mission was not to rediscover history, it was to verify silence. Over the following days, Harkins's divers cataloged minor artifacts: brass fittings, small ammunition, and fragments of electronic housings marked property of U.S. Signal Corps. Yet none of the major components, no radar assemblies, no control consoles, remained. It's like someone cleaned house, one diver said over the comm line. They all knew what that meant. Another team had been there first. On the 5th day, sonar picked up faint metallic objects a few hundred meters west of the main wreck. Harkins ordered a descent, and there, partially embedded in the sand, his team found 2 curved pieces of plating, each bearing serial numbers that matched the missing John Morgan stern section. The edges were laser smooth, far beyond any cutting method available in 1943. This was modern work, Harkins wrote, done by people who knew exactly what they were looking for. When he submitted his report upon return to Washington, he was told to classify all findings under restricted, subsea engineering. The following month, his entire unit's files on the expedition were removed from station archives. The only surviving evidence came from a copy of Harkins's personal log, kept privately until his death in 1981. That log also contained one cryptic note on the final page: "Area not abandoned. Unauthorized vessel observed at night. No running lights. 2 figures on deck. Too far for ID. Possibly government, possibly not. Mission terminated next day." Years later, in a 1995 interview, one of Harkins's surviving divers, Chief Petty Officer Lawrence Dean, recalled how the commander had warned them to forget what they'd seen. He said, "The ocean keeps secrets, and so do we. But you could see it ate at him. He wanted to know who got there first." When sonar images from that 1967 dive resurfaced decades later, analysts noted the uncanny precision of the missing sections, straight, geometric, as if carved by industrial tools rather than nature. Some experts speculated that an unrecorded Cold War-era recovery mission, possibly tied to early electronic warfare research, had stripped the wreck clean. Whatever the truth, the John Morgan site became permanently restricted by naval order the following year. Its coordinates were removed from civilian charts, and divers who approached were warned off by patrol craft. Harkins's report vanished into archives that remain sealed to this day. And so, the pattern continued, another generation sent to find answers, only to come back with more questions. The Liberty ship that sank in 1943 had become more than a wartime relic. It was a ghost on the seafloor, visited, altered, and erased, each time leaving behind fewer clues than before. Today, the wreck of the SS John Morgan rests in silence 40 miles off the Delaware coast, her broken hull wrapped in layers of cold Atlantic silt. But the story she carries has never stopped echoing through naval archives, dive logs, and the memories of those who dared to descend into her shadows. More than 80 years after her sinking, the questions remain: what exactly went down with her, and who has been keeping it secret for so long? In 2003, a private research team from the University of Rhode Island applied for permission to conduct a non-intrusive sonar study of the John Morgan site. Their request was denied, twice. The official reason cited hazardous ordnance and unexploded materials. Yet internal emails later revealed that U.S. Navy representatives had intervened to prevent civilian access, calling the site national security sensitive. The same designation used for Cold War submarine wrecks. The few sonar scans that were completed, taken from outside the restricted boundary, revealed something that stunned even veteran researchers. Beneath layers of sediment, several geometric voids were visible within the wreck's structure, perfectly rectangular, as if cargo containers had been lifted whole. The sonar imagery aligned with Harkins's notes from 1967, clean removals, not natural collapse. The evidence pointed unmistakably to a deliberate operation, one that had taken place long after the war ended. Archivists digging through declassified files uncovered yet another clue. A 1958 memorandum from the Department of Defense referenced a project titled Operation Tidecall, a deep-sea retrieval initiative conducted in cooperation with Allied forces and authorized under special executive order. Though the memo never named a location, the coordinates were blacked out. The dates matched the known sonar disturbances around the John Morgan site. The British National Archives, for their part, contain references to maritime technical material recovered under cooperative naval salvage protocols. Historians now believe Operation Tidecall may have been the mission that stripped the John Morgan clean. If true, what had been recovered, and why the secrecy, may never be known. Some suspect that early radar components aboard the John Morgan contained prototype materials later developed into Cold War signal interception devices. Others argue the operation was less about technology and more about control, ensuring that whatever secrets lay on the seafloor stayed out of foreign hands, even those of allies. Among the few who still cared to ask questions was naval archivist Julia Marin, who in 2010 publicly challenged the continuing classification of John Morgan's files. "If this was only radar," she wrote, "the public should know. If it was more, the public deserves to know why it still matters." Her request for declassification was denied. The reasoning? Ongoing operational relevance. To this day, divers who have approached the restricted zone report faint radar interference on their equipment. static bursts that distort GPS readings and compasses. Whether that's coincidence, old metal, or something deliberately transmitted, no one can say. Few have risked returning since. As for the men who first descended into the wreck in 1943, their names remain etched on the Navy Memorial Wall: Lieutenant Frank Mallory, Petty Officer Raymond Holt, and Commander Harold Vance, declared missing, presumed lost. Their families never learned what they died for, only that their mission served the greater security of the United States. One surviving line from Mallory's recovered notebook sums up their story: "We dive to recover what's lost. But sometimes, what's lost is meant to stay that way." Today, the SS John Morgan remains under restricted protection, its coordinates omitted from civilian charts. Unmarked vessels still patrol the area occasionally, quiet, watchful, unannounced. The Navy neither confirms nor denies their presence. And so, the Liberty ship that burned in the fog of 1943 continues to keep her silence. Beneath the rolling Atlantic, beyond reach of light or history, rests a vessel that carried not only supplies for war, but secrets meant never to surface. The mystery endures, untouched, in the deep where truth and water become one.